Hi, and welcome to First Look, a Bible study that looks at the set readings, the lectionary readings for the coming Sunday. My name's Carl, and it's good to have you with us today. In this Bible study, we're going to be looking at Matthew chapter 23, verses 1 to 12, which has some really feisty things Jesus has to say to the Pharisees and the Scribes. Before we dive into our Bible study, if you've not had the chance to do so already, you might like to download the sheet that accompanies this study. On it, it's got our reading for today, some space for you to make your own notes, and the questions that we're going to be exploring later on. So, let's dive in to today's passage. Once again, we've got Jesus in the temple courtyard in Jerusalem. He's survived the encounters that we've seen over the past few weeks as we've worked our way through this sort of chunk of Matthew's Gospel. He survived those encounters with particular groups within Judaism that have sought to challenge him. The temple authorities, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Herodians. And now, having silenced those critics, Jesus turns back to the crowds that have gathered in the temple courtyard to hear him preach, and his own disciples. He begins to teach them, and he has some pretty feisty things to say to the Pharisees and the Scribes. Now, the Pharisees were the main group that have opposed Jesus all along, and they were one of the key subgroups within the very diverse and lively Judaism of Jesus' day. They were very much focused on holiness, they were very radical, they had a strong emphasis on the law of Moses. The scribes were religious experts in the law of Moses. So these are the groups that Jesus takes on in this passage. Now it's worth keeping in mind, before we get into the details of the text itself, the broader context in which the author of Matthew's Gospel was writing. Matthew's Gospel was almost certainly written after the destruction of the Jerusalem temple in the year 70. And that was a cataclysmic event as far as the Jewish people were concerned. It had a massive impact on their self-understanding. So you end up with a lot of wrestling going on as to what does it mean to be God's people in the synagogues after this time. And there was some conflict that was beginning to emerge between Christian communities like that of Matthew's, who were still in the synagogues at that point, and proponents of rabbinic Judaism. There was beginning to be a kind of moving apart of the ways. We're not fully there yet, but I think some of the stuff in this passage reflects that conflict that Matthew's community found itself involved in. Now, there's some dispute when we think about what type of literature this is as to where Matthew 23 fits within the overall picture of the Gospel. There are some commentators who argue that Matthew 23 is part of one of those 5 books of the New Covenant that run throughout Matthew, basically collections of Jesus' teaching that are scattered through that Gospel. And there are 5 of those because there are 5 books of the Torah. So it's casting Jesus very much as the new Moses. Those 5 books are the Sermon on the Mount that we find in chapters 5 to 7, the commissioning of the disciples in chapter 10, the kingdom parables of chapter 13, Jesus' teaching on living in a Christ-centered community in chapter 18, and this section full of warnings and challenges in Matthew 23 to 25, or so the argument goes. Now, there are some who disagree with lumping Matthew chapter 23 in with chapters 24 and 25. And the reason for that is at the end of chapter 23, beginning of chapter 24, Jesus actually leaves the temple courtyard and goes and sits on the side of the Mount of Olives with his disciples, who ask him a question, which then launches into a set of eschatological teachings looking forward to the future coming of the kingdom of God in its fullness. Because of that change of setting, and because Jesus is asked a question, some argue that actually Matthew 23 is something different, and that what we have here is Jesus acting more like one of the Old Testament prophets, like we see in Amos, for example, or parts of Isaiah, where the prophet is very much calling God's people back to God and calling them out for their having wandered. It's worth keeping in mind as we read this text that what Matthew is doing is building on a little snippet of Jesus' teaching against the scribes that we find in Mark chapter 12, verses 38 to 40. And in Luke chapter 11, 37 to 52, Luke has a similar kind of section. So it's possible that Matthew and Luke are drawing on the same source material in putting together this part of their Gospels. Now, if we take this section, this first part of Matthew 23, as forming one of the 5 books of the New Covenant, if you will, what this is very much about is casting Jesus as the new Moses. But I think that's something that we can carry through because of other things that are said, whether or not we view the text as belonging in that way. In verse 2, there's some debate about what the seat of Moses that Jesus talks about, that the Pharisees and the scribes sit on, actually means. Is it figurative? Is it a symbol of their authority? Or is it a literal seat? Is it something that they would have sat on when they taught in the synagogues and the schools? The Greek word that's used, cathedra, is the same word that's used when you're in cathedrals. You have the bishop's seat that looks down over their cathedral, and that's a symbol of their authority in their cathedral and indeed in their diocese. So it may be that there's something similar going on there. But either way, whether it's figurative or literal, it symbolises the idea that the Pharisees and the scribes very much saw themselves as in the line of Moses, as the inheritors of his law and the people who were responsible primarily for its interpretation thereof among the people. In verse 3, in the first part of it, Jesus calls the people to listen to what the Pharisees and the scribes have to say and do it, which itself is a quotation from Deuteronomy, specifically Deuteronomy 17, verse 10. And that was a very common rabbinic thing to say. But in the second part of this, Jesus calls out those scribes and Pharisees, noting that what they do isn't necessarily consistent with what they say and with the teaching of the law of Moses. They're failing to put into practice their own teaching, failing to practice what they preach, if you will. And he was not alone, Jesus, in denouncing that kind of hypocrisy among elements of the rabbinic tradition of the time. In verse 4, Jesus talks about laying heavy burdens on the shoulders of the people. And talking about burdens in this context, we might use the word yoke instead, taking on the yoke of the Torah, taking on the burden of its teachings. Jesus, if you remember in Matthew chapter 11, verses 28 to 30, invites us to come to him when we're heavy laden, when we're overburdened, and find our rest there, because his yoke is easy, his burden is light. It's linking in with those same sorts of ideas. So in contrast to the light burden of Jesus, he's saying the Pharisees and the scribes are piling really heavy burdens down on the people of Israel, down on ordinary folk. We're reminded, as we move on in the critique of these religious leaders who are laying heavy burdens on people, of Jesus' teachings against outward piety and showy religion, when he critiques the way that the Pharisees and the scribes were deliberately conspicuous, ostentatious religious clothing. He talks about the prayer boxes that Jews wore on their arm and on their head when they came to pray. The prayer boxes contained scrolls with sections of the law of Moses within them. So that could be, for example, Exodus 13, 1 to 16. And he talks about them having lots of extra tassels and knots in their prayer garments. And they were often used, those garments and those knots, to remind people of God's commandments. So essentially, he's saying that they're taking something that was normal and part of everyday life for observant Jews and making it really showy, so particularly big and grandiose versions thereof, to draw attention to their public piety. And Jesus is going on then to critique the way that not only are they showy in their piety, but they're status seeking, and they revel in honours and titles, and you might say, even in that little kind of local context, celebrity status. To call someone rabbi in that context was apparently the equivalent of calling them sir or madam. It was a mark of respect. And we know that various high-profile rabbis like to be called father or master. So there's all these titles to do with status, and Jesus is kind of saying we don't need all of that, I think. He's saying that what we need is something more egalitarian, more anti-hierarchical. Though it is worth noting, as we see in Ephesians, for example, that there are lots of different titles used for Christian leaders throughout the New Testament. And I don't think this is about obsessing over how our clergy choose to dress, or whether a priest wants to be known as father or mother or something like that. I don't think that's the point here. I think the point is there's something about setting ourselves up as grander than we are, and forgetting that actually Jesus is our master and God is our Father. The heart of this passage is summed up in the final, very difficult and challenging 2 verses to really take to heart. They're about gospel reversals, humble people being exalted, exalted people being humbled, and serving others as our primary calling. Jesus has brought in things like this before. So, for example, we could look at Matthew 20, verses 24 to 28. And these things remind us of, I suppose, what's really at the heart of this passage. Not lording it over other people, not piling burdens on others that we were not prepared to keep ourselves or to try to make lighter. Instead, we're called to be people who have integrity, who walk the talk, and who say what we mean. It's also helpful to note as we look at this passage that we could argue that what Jesus is doing is as bad as the Scribes and the Pharisees in making apparently lofty and challenging pronouncements. The difference, I think, between what Jesus does and what the Scribes and Pharisees do here is that Jesus is doing this in the story of Holy Week. Jesus is doing this on the way to the cross. He does it as someone who is prepared to walk the talk, as it were. And that's another important thing to keep in mind as we grapple with this passage. Are we people who walk the talk?